The long road home. Sergeant Leah Monroe Matthews stood at the edge of the bustling airport terminal, her senses dull from the weight of months spent overseas in grueling service. Her mind buzzed with exhaustion, and her body screamed for rest. The deployment had been longer than anticipated, physically and emotionally draining, leaving her shoulders heavy with both the duffel bag she carried and the memories of her time in the Middle East. Her uniform, once crisp and immaculate, now bore the marks of months in the harsh desert sun. The olive-green fabric was worn at the elbows, and sand had found its way into the creases, stubbornly clinging as a reminder of the life she'd left behind overseas. Her boots were scuffed, her face tired, but her back was straight. Leah had survived. She had made it home. As she made her way through the terminal, weaving through crowds of vacationers, businessmen, and families, Leah couldn't help but feel out of place. She caught glimpses of carefree faces, people enjoying the luxury of normal life, lives untouched by the stress of battle and loss. Every sound seemed too loud, every movement too fast. She longed for the quiet that the battlefield, for all its dangers, had provided. Leah arrived at the gate, her heart heavy with the anticipation of the flight that would take her home. A bittersweet feeling clung to her. Home meant peace, but it also meant returning to a life that could never fully understand what she had experienced. Still, she couldn't wait to see her family, especially her younger brother, Elijah, who was her anchor in this world. Their bond had deepened after their father's death, and Leah knew that Elijah had been waiting anxiously for her return. Sergeant Matthews. A voice called her name, pulling Leah from her thoughts. She turned to find a smiling flight attendant standing near the counter. "Yes, we've upgraded your seat to first class. It's a small token of appreciation for your service. Thank you for everything you've done," the flight attendant said warmly. Leah blinked, caught off guard. "First class," she repeated, the words foreign on her lips. She had never flown anything other than economy. The thought of the luxury first class offered felt too grand for someone like her. She was just a soldier, a humble servant of her country. "Yes, ma'am, you deserve it," the attendant replied, pressing the new boarding pass into her hand with a respectful nod. Leah forced a smile and thanked her, though a strange sense of unease washed over her. She wasn't used to the attention, and she certainly wasn't used to sitting in first class. Still, she accepted the gesture with quiet grace and approached the gate, her boots tapping softly against the airport floor. Leah found herself sinking into the wide, plush seat in the first-class cabin. She was surrounded by business travelers in tailored suits and luxury brand luggage, none of whom gave her more than a cursory glance. The difference in treatment between here and the dusty outposts where she'd spent so many months was jarring. She placed her duffel bag beneath her seat, feeling the eyes of other passengers on her, perhaps wondering why she was there. But she ignored the stares and focused on adjusting to the surprising comfort. The seat felt foreign to her, soft, indulgent, too easy for someone who had spent nights sleeping on hard earth. The noise of boarding passengers swirled around her, a symphony of normalcy she wasn't sure how to re-enter. Just as Leah began to settle in, a shadow fell across her. "Excuse me," a cold, clipped voice said. Leah looked up to find a tall, middle-aged man standing over her. He wore an expensive navy blue suit, his posture exuding an air of authority and entitlement. His brows were furrowed in clear irritation, and Leah immediately felt a tightening in her chest. She straightened in her seat. "Yes," she replied cautiously. The man glanced at her with thinly veiled contempt, then at the boarding pass in his hand. "I think you're in my seat," he said, his voice laced with impatience. "This is first class, not coach." Leah felt the sting of his words immediately. It was a statement she had heard many times before in different forms. Unspoken assumptions that someone like her didn't belong in certain spaces. Her uniform should have been a symbol of pride, but to some, it was still just an uncomfortable reminder that she was different. "I'm sorry, sir, but this is my seat," Leah said, her tone calm but firm as she showed him her boarding pass. The man's eyes flicked to the pass, then back to her with a disbelieving scoff. "There must be a mistake. This isn't where you're supposed to be," he insisted, his voice rising slightly as if summoning the agreement of the other passengers. Leah's hands clenched the armrests of her seat, her jaw tight. It wasn't the first time she'd been treated as if she didn't belong somewhere, but the sting of it never seemed to dull. She opened her mouth to respond but was interrupted by a flight attendant who had witnessed the exchange. "Is there a problem here?" the attendant asked, her tone professional, but with a sharp edge that suggested she was prepared to intervene. The man gestured toward Leah. "This soldier's in my seat. I think there's been a mistake." The flight attendant quickly checked both tickets before smiling kindly at Leah. "Sergeant Matthews, your seat is indeed in first class. Thank you for your service," she said with sincere appreciation before turning to the man. "Sir, your seat is in row 5, just a couple of rows back." The man's face flushed with embarrassment, but he didn't offer an apology. Instead, he grumbled under his breath and stomped off toward his assigned seat, his posture rigid with irritation. Leah sat back, feeling a flood of mixed emotions: gratitude toward the flight attendant for standing up for her, relief that the confrontation had ended, and yet a gnawing sense of frustration that even in moments like these, she still had to defend her right to be treated as an equal. As the plane taxied down the runway and lifted into the sky, Leah closed her eyes, trying to push the incident from her mind. She had more important things to think about. The thought of home, of her brother's face, pulled her back to a happier place. But even as she tried to relax, Leah couldn't help but notice the occasional glances the man threw her way from his seat. His disapproving stare lingered, and she could almost feel his contempt like a weight pressing down on her. It reminded her of the many battles she had fought, both in uniform and out of it, against people who saw her as less than because of her skin color or her gender. Leah wasn't about to let this man's prejudice ruin her long-awaited journey home, but the tension hung in the air like a storm cloud, heavy and unavoidable. As the plane soared through the clouds, Leah made a decision. She would not let this confrontation define her journey. She had seen too much, fought too hard, to let this man's ignorance weigh her down. And as she prepared to take action, she knew the real battle was just beginning. Reflections at 30,000 feet. The cabin hummed with the steady drone of the engines as the plane leveled off into its cruising altitude. Leah shifted in her seat, trying to get comfortable. The man's disdainful glances still lingered in the back of her mind, like an irritating itch she couldn't quite scratch. She had tried to brush it off. She had faced far worse, but it was harder than she expected. It wasn't just the incident itself, it was what it symbolized. The man's condescending attitude toward her, a soldier who had risked her life for the freedoms he enjoyed, was a harsh reminder of the world she lived in. Even in a first-class seat, one she hadn't asked for but had been gifted because of her service, her presence was questioned. The air inside the plane was cool and dry, and the quiet murmurs of conversation from nearby passengers filled the space. Leah closed her eyes, resting her head against the seat, but her mind refused to settle. Instead, it wandered back to the desert. The harsh heat, the endless stretches of sand, the distant rumble of trucks and choppers. It was a world far removed from the luxury of first class. Leah had always been the type to rise above, to push through adversity with quiet strength. But this moment of quiet prejudice, of being told she didn't belong, was different. It wasn't about the seat or the man's words. It was about the larger battle she had been fighting her whole life. The battle to be seen as more than just her race or gender. The battle to be recognized for her service, her sacrifice, her humanity. As the plane glided smoothly through the sky, Leah's thoughts drifted to her deployment. The faces of her fellow soldiers, brothers and sisters in arms, appeared in her mind. Some of them wouldn't be coming home. Some of them had given the ultimate sacrifice for people like the man sitting just a few rows back, people who didn't know their names or their stories. She thought of Specialist Rivera, the young soldier who had been full of jokes and optimism, always able to lift spirits in the darkest moments. He had been the first to fall in their unit. The IED that claimed his life had shaken Leah to her core, a reminder of how fragile life truly was in a war zone. She had written a letter to his family, the hardest thing she had ever done, trying to find the right words to express what Rivera had meant to them all. Then there was Corporal Williams, a steady presence, always calm under pressure. He had been a mentor to Leah, someone who had helped her navigate the challenges of military life. He had saved her life during an ambush, pulling her to cover when gunfire erupted around them. She had been unable to return the favor when he needed her most. He had been taken by a sniper's bullet just weeks before their deployment ended. Leah blinked back the tears that threatened to spill over. She had learned to grieve quietly, to carry the weight of loss in silence. It was a skill every soldier developed, especially those who led others into battle. You couldn't afford to fall apart. You had to be strong for those who depended on you. But the pain never fully went away. It lingered, a dull ache in the background, always waiting for quiet moments like these to resurface. As Leah stared out the window at the endless expanse of clouds, she felt the familiar pang of survivor's guilt gnaw at her. Why was she the one who made it home? What made her worthy of sitting in this seat, while Rivera and Williams would never have the chance to fly home again? She had never been one to dwell on her own feelings, but the longer the flight dragged on, the more the man's sneer replayed in her mind. He didn't know. He didn't know what it had taken for her to get here. The sacrifices, the sleepless nights, the constant weight of knowing that at any moment it could have been her family receiving a knock on the door from a military chaplain. Leah shook herself out of the memories, reminding herself that she had made it home for a reason. She had a life to live, a brother to return to, a world waiting for her to find her place in it once again. But as she settled back into her seat, her eyes catching the occasional glances from the man in row 5, she couldn't help but wonder about him. What had driven him to react the way he did? Was it simple prejudice? Was it a sense of entitlement, of superiority, that led him to believe that she didn't belong in first class because she was a soldier, a black woman, or both? Or was there something deeper? She had encountered men like him before. Men who judged her before she had the chance to speak, who saw her uniform and assumed they knew her story. But she had also learned that people were often more complex than they seemed. Sometimes, their anger or disdain masked their own insecurities, their own struggles. Leah wasn't one to hold grudges, but she also wasn't one to let things slide. She had always believed in confronting problems head-on, in trying to understand the people she disagreed with. Maybe it was her military training, or maybe it was just who she had always been. Someone who sought to build bridges, even when others tried to tear them down. Leah reached into the small pouch attached to the back of the seat in front of her and pulled out a notepad. The blank page stared back at her, waiting. She had used this notepad during her deployment to write letters home, to record her thoughts when the weight of war became too much to bear. Writing had always been her way of making sense of things, of finding clarity when the world seemed chaotic. She tapped the pen against the page, thinking about what she wanted to say. She wasn't sure if the man in row 5 would read it, or if he would even care, but she couldn't sit here for the rest of the flight, pretending that his words hadn't hurt her, that they didn't matter. They did matter, not just because of what he had said, but because of what they represented. Leah began to write. Dear Sir, I understand that there may have been some confusion or misunderstanding earlier. I'd like to take a moment to share a few thoughts. I am Sergeant Leah Matthews, and I've spent the last few months serving overseas. My time in the military has taught me many things about resilience, sacrifice, and the value of protecting the freedoms we all enjoy. But there's another lesson I've learned, one that I hold close to my heart. We are all more alike than we are different. We are all human beings with struggles, hopes, and dreams. I may wear a uniform, and I may sit in a seat that you didn't expect me to sit in, but that doesn't make me any less deserving of respect. Nor does it make you any less deserving of the same. I've seen the cost of freedom firsthand. I've lost friends who gave their lives so that we can sit in a plane, fly across the sky, and return home to our families. I carry their memory with me every day, and I honor their sacrifice by trying to live with kindness and understanding. I hope that one day we can all see each other for who we truly are, not for the assumptions we make based on appearances, but for our shared humanity. I believe that we can learn from one another if we are willing to listen. Thank you for taking the time to read this. I wish you well on the rest of your journey. Sincerely, Sergeant Leah Matthews. Leah folded the note carefully, feeling a strange sense of peace settle over her. She wasn't sure what the man would make of it, but that wasn't really the point. The point was that she had taken the high road, that she had chosen to respond with compassion rather than anger. It was a small gesture, but it was her way of reclaiming her dignity, of reminding herself that she could rise above. She pressed the call button for the flight attendant, who appeared a moment later with a polite smile. "Could you please deliver this to the gentleman in seat 5A?" Leah asked quietly. The flight attendant, who had witnessed the earlier exchange, nodded in understanding. She took the note and disappeared down the aisle. Leah watched her go, her heart pounding slightly in anticipation. Would he read it? Would he even care? For the rest of the flight, Leah sat in silence, her mind churning with the possibilities. She didn't know what would happen next, but one thing was certain: this journey wasn't over yet. A note delivered, a moment of reflection. The steady hum of the aircraft's engines filled the cabin, a constant reminder that they were suspended thousands of feet above the world below. Leah stared out the window, her mind racing despite the serene view of endless clouds. The folded note, now in the hands of the flight attendant, was en route to seat 5A. She wasn't sure what would come of it, but she had done what felt right. Now, all she could do was wait. She wasn't expecting an apology. In fact, Leah wasn't even sure the man would bother to read the note at all, but writing it had helped her process the interaction in a way that anger never could. The old Leah, the one who had entered boot camp full of righteous indignation and a fierce desire to prove herself, might have lashed out, but time and experience had taught her that battles weren't always won by force. Sometimes they were won with a quiet resolve, with understanding and patience. The flight attendant approached the man with the note, and Leah found herself watching, almost holding her breath. She saw the attendant hand it to him, his brow furrowing as he unfolded the paper. He glanced at it briefly, then looked back at the attendant, clearly confused. He leaned over, whispered something to her, and she simply nodded before walking away. Leah's eyes shifted back to her own space. The man didn't immediately react. He simply stared at the note, his expression unreadable. Part of her was curious to see what he would do, but another part of her didn't want to give the moment any more power than it deserved. It was out of her hands now. She settled back in her seat and tried to focus on something else. Anything else, but her mind continued to wander. There had been so many moments in her life when she had been judged for something beyond her control, where people had assumed she didn't belong. As a black woman, as a soldier, and sometimes even as a leader, Leah had faced her share of obstacles. But this was different. This was supposed to be a moment of peace, a return home after months of deployment, a chance to decompress. Instead, it had turned into a reminder that no matter what she had done, no matter what uniform she wore, there would always be people who questioned her place in the world. The soft clinking of silverware pulled Leah from her thoughts. The flight attendants were serving the first-class passengers their meals, an upscale affair compared to what she had been used to in coach. A small tray was placed in front of her, complete with a hot meal, fresh fruit, and a glass of wine. She hadn't expected the luxury, and truthfully, it made her feel slightly uncomfortable. She was used to ration packs and lukewarm coffee in the field, not fine dining in the sky. Leah took a bite, but the food tasted bland. Her appetite had diminished ever since the interaction with the man. She found herself picking at her meal, her mind unable to fully relax. What was he thinking? Was he angry? Ashamed? Or worse, was he indifferent? It had been only a few minutes since the note had been delivered, but it felt like hours. She wanted to let go, to sink into the comforts of her seat and leave the confrontation behind her, but something inside her wouldn't allow it. Leah had always been a problem solver. In the military, there was no room for unresolved tension. Conflicts had to be addressed, often immediately, because lives depended on it. Here, in the civilian world, things weren't as straightforward. Sometimes people didn't acknowledge the hurt they caused. Sometimes they didn't even realize they had done anything wrong. As she sipped her wine, she reflected on her early years in the service. The military had been her escape from a troubled neighborhood where opportunities were scarce and dreams seemed unreachable. She had joined the army not just for the chance to serve her country, but to prove to herself and to the world that she was capable of more. Her mother had cried the day she enlisted, not because she was proud, but because she was terrified. Leah had promised her she'd come home, but she knew her mother had never fully trusted that promise. The army had shaped Leah into who she was now, strong, disciplined, and proud of her identity. But it had also shown her the deep-rooted prejudices that still thrived, even in places where unity should have been the strongest. Leah had risen through the ranks, but not without having to constantly prove herself, especially to those who didn't believe someone like her belonged in a position of authority. There had been times when she had questioned whether the struggle was worth it. She had lost friends and brothers in arms, and with every loss came the same nagging question. Did the world even notice? Did people like the man in seat 5A, who lived their lives free from the burdens of service, understand the price of their comfort? Probably not. And that was the hardest part, knowing that despite everything she and others had sacrificed, there were still those who saw her as less than. Time passed slowly. The plane continued its steady path across the sky, and Leah felt the weight of the hours pressing down on her. She had tried reading a book, but the words blurred together. She had closed her eyes, hoping to drift off, but sleep eluded her. Every now and then, she caught herself glancing toward row 5. The man was still seated there, still holding the note. At one point, he folded it and placed it on the tray in front of him, but he hadn't moved to speak with her. Leah tried to convince herself that it didn't matter. She had done her part. She had responded with kindness, even when it would have been easier to ignore the situation or lash out. If he didn't want to engage, that was his choice. Still, the silence felt heavy, as if something unresolved hung between them in the air. Just as Leah was about to give up on the idea of any further interaction, she noticed movement in her peripheral vision. The man had stood up, his posture rigid, and he began making his way toward her. Leah felt her stomach tighten, bracing herself for what might come next. She wasn't sure if this was going to be an apology, a confrontation, or something in between. He stopped a few feet away from her seat, looking awkward and unsure of himself. His earlier arrogance seemed to have melted away, replaced by something more vulnerable. Leah looked up at him, meeting his gaze without flinching. "Sergeant Matthews," he began, his voice quieter than before. I got your note." Leah nodded, waiting for him to continue. She could see the internal struggle on his face, as if he was grappling with what to say. It was clear that whatever pride had fueled his earlier outburst had given way to a kind of humility. The man shifted uncomfortably on his feet, his hands fidgeting as he spoke. "I wanted to apologize," he finally said, the words coming out in a rush. "I was wrong. I made assumptions about you that I had no right to make. I shouldn't have judged you, especially not like that." Leah didn't say anything at first. She wanted to give him the space to express himself fully, to own his mistake without rushing through it. "I've been thinking about what you wrote," he continued, glancing down at the note still folded in his hand. "About how we're all more alike than we are different. You're right. I don't know what I was thinking, but I wasn't fair to you, and I'm sorry." Leah studied him for a moment, searching his face for sincerity. She could see that this was difficult for him, that he wasn't used to admitting fault, especially in such a public way. It wasn't just an apology. It was a shift in his entire demeanor. The man who had once looked at her with disdain now seemed uncertain, even remorseful. "Thank you," Leah said softly. "I appreciate your apology." He nodded, his eyes still downcast. "It's just, seeing you in that uniform, it brought back memories. My brother, he was in the army too. He died a few years ago in Afghanistan." Leah's heart tightened. She hadn't expected that. She could see the pain in his eyes now, the weight he carried, and it dawned on her that his anger hadn't been about her at all. It had been about his own unresolved grief. "I'm sorry for your loss," Leah said sincerely. "I'd lost friends too. It never gets easier." The man looked up at her, his expression softening even more. "Thank you. And I'm sorry again for what I said. It wasn't right." Leah nodded, her own heart heavy with the understanding that people's pain often led them to lash out in ways they didn't fully comprehend. She had seen it time and time again, both on the battlefield and back home. Everyone carried their own burdens, and sometimes those burdens collided with others in unexpected ways. The man offered a small, hesitant smile. "I just wanted you to know that I respect what you've done. For this country, for people like me, and even for people who don't deserve it." Leah smiled back, feeling a sense of closure settle over her. "We all deserve kindness," she replied softly, "even when it's hard to see it." The man gave a final nod, then turned and walked back to his seat, leaving Leah alone with her thoughts once more. But this time, the tension had lifted. She had made her point, and he had heard it. The battle, it seemed, had been won, not with anger or confrontation, but with understanding and compassion. Leah glanced out the window again, feeling a sense of peace she hadn't felt since she boarded the plane. It wasn't just the end of the confrontation. It was something deeper. She had seen the man's pain, and he had seen her humanity. In that moment, they had bridged a gap that so many others never crossed. And that, Leah thought, was the real victory. Homeward bound and hard realities. Leah watched the man retreat to his seat, her heart feeling lighter than it had since the beginning of the flight. It wasn't often that people owned up to their mistakes in such a sincere way, and she appreciated that he had done so, even though the scars of their interaction lingered. Still, it was a small moment of healing, something she hadn't realized she needed as much as she did. The flight was quiet now, the soft clinks of cutlery and murmured conversations from the other passengers forming the subtle backdrop. Leah leaned back in her seat, finally allowing herself to exhale fully. She stared out the window at the endless expanse of clouds, thinking about the home she was heading toward. She hadn't seen her brother in over a year, and she wondered how much had changed while she was away. Home, she thought, feeling the warmth spread through her chest. Yet beneath that warmth was an undercurrent of unease. Coming home always had its challenges. She had been here before, returning from war, re-entering a world that didn't quite fit anymore. Each time she left, she felt like part of her stayed behind on the battlefield, as though the person who returned was never entirely whole. Would Elijah notice that she had changed again? He always had a way of seeing through her stoic facade. When their father passed away, it was Elijah who had been the glue that held the family together, even though he was younger by 5 years. He was quiet but strong, never allowing his emotions to spill out recklessly, but Leah knew that he had always worried about her more than he let on. The flight attendants were moving up and down the aisles, checking on passengers, clearing trays, and preparing for the descent. Leah had been lost in thought, but she suddenly noticed one of them standing by her side. "Excuse me, Sergeant Matthews," the attendant asked softly, as though not wanting to disturb her. Leah turned to her with a polite smile. "Yes. There's someone who'd like to buy you a drink, courtesy of a passenger in row 5A, the attendant said with a hint of a smile. Leah blinked, surprised. She hadn't expected the man to offer any further gesture. His apology had felt genuine, and in her mind, the matter was settled. But this small act of kindness was unexpected. It wasn't about the drink itself, but the intent behind it, A peace offering of sorts, one last attempt to extend an olive branch. "That's very kind," Lee replied, feeling her lips curve into a small smile. "I'll take a water, please. I've had enough excitement for one day." The flight attendant smiled back knowingly and left to retrieve the drink. Leah chuckled to herself. A part of her was relieved that the tension from earlier had evaporated, though she couldn't help but feel how surreal it was. She had gone from being told she didn't belong in first class to receiving an apology and a drink offer from the same man. Life had a funny way of unfolding in unexpected ways. As she waited for the water, Leah's thoughts wandered back to her life outside of this metal tube hurling through the sky. Her phone was tucked away in her duffel bag, powered off. She wasn't quite ready to face the world just yet. Coming back from a deployment was always a strange transition. The phone calls, texts, and emails would come flooding in soon enough, asking her how she was, congratulating her on making it back safely, but those interactions always felt hollow compared to the reality she lived. Her world was so different from the one most people back home could understand. How could she explain the sound of gunfire at dawn, the suffocating heat, the sight of dust swirling around their convoy as they moved through hostile territory, or the moments of stillness after the chaos when she had time to think about the people she had lost? Those were experiences she could never fully convey, not even to her family. As Leah sipped her water, she thought about her brother again. Elijah had always admired her strength, often joking that she was the rock in their family. But in truth, Elijah had been her constant. He was the one who had taken care of their mother after their father's death when Leah was away on her first deployment. Elijah had been the one who kept the family together, despite his own grief. Leah owed him more than she could ever express, and now that their mother was gone, it was just the two of them left to carry on the family legacy. Leah hadn't been home for their mother's funeral, something she still carried with her like a weight in her chest. Her deployment had overlapped with her mother's final days, and even though she had tried to get back in time, the military didn't always allow for personal needs to take precedence over duty. Elijah had handled everything, from the hospital visits to the funeral arrangements, all while shielding Leah from the burden of guilt she felt for not being there. That guilt had gnawed at her for months. Every time she called Elijah during her deployment, he had assured her that it was okay, that their mother understood. But Leah knew better. Their mother had always wanted her children close, and Leah had failed to give her that in her final moments. Now she was returning to a home that felt emptier than ever. As she sipped her water, Leah reflected on how disconnected she sometimes felt from her civilian life. The truth was, she had spent so many years in the military that she didn't know if she could ever fully reintegrate into the life she had left behind. It wasn't just the experiences she had lived through, but the mindset the military had ingrained in her. There was a sense of purpose and camaraderie in the Army that didn't exist in the civilian world. Out here, everything felt more fragmented, more isolated. The man in seat 5A, David, as he had introduced himself, had turned back toward his seat, leaving Leah to her thoughts. She caught a glimpse of him out of the corner of her eye. He wasn't looking at her, but there was something different about his posture now, a kind of humility that hadn't been there before. His apology had been more than just words. Leah could tell that his grief for his brother was real, and in some small way, she understood where his pain had come from. David's story had added a layer of complexity to their interaction. His brother's death in Afghanistan had clearly left him with wounds that hadn't healed. Leah had seen that kind of grief before, in the families of her fallen comrades, in her own unit when they lost one of their own. It was a grief that could harden people, make them defensive, and lash out when they didn't even realize they were hurting. She knew that all too well. In the military, grief wasn't something you talked about. You mourned in silence, kept your feelings locked away because there was always another mission, another fight to prepare for. Leah had become an expert at compartmentalizing her emotions, pushing them down so she could focus on the task at hand. But here, on this flight, with nothing to do but think, those emotions had a way of creeping back up to the surface. She thought about the letter she had written to Specialist Rivera's parents after he died. She had struggled to find the right words, knowing that no letter could ever truly express the depth of their loss. But she had tried to convey how much Rivera had meant to their unit, how he had been a source of laughter and light even in the darkest times. She had promised them that his sacrifice would never be forgotten, that his memory would live on in those who had served with him. Leah had written dozens of those letters over the years, each one tearing at her heart a little more. It never got easier, and every time she put pen to paper, she wondered if her words could ever be enough. As the plane began its slow descent, the familiar sounds of passengers preparing to land filled the cabin. Leah was ready to be on solid ground again, ready to leave the confines of the plane behind. But more than that, she was ready to see her brother. Elijah had texted her before she boarded, telling her he would be waiting for her at the airport. She could already picture his face, the same mixture of relief and concern he always wore when she came back from a deployment. Leah gathered her things, her duffel bag slung over her shoulder, and waited for the plane to land. David remained in his seat, looking deep in thought. Leah wasn't sure if they would speak again before they disembarked, but she felt that their earlier exchange had been enough. Sometimes, understanding didn't need more than a few words. As the plane touched down, and the seatbelt sign dinged off, Leah stood and stretched, feeling the weight of the long flight lift from her shoulders. She grabbed her bag, ready to disembark, when she felt a light tap on her arm. It was David. "Sergeant Matthews," he said softly. "I just wanted to say thank you again. For everything." Leah nodded, offering a kind smile. "You're welcome. Take care of yourself." With that, they parted ways, each heading off into their own separate lives. Leah stepped off the plane, her boots hitting the tarmac with a sense of finality. The journey wasn't over, but it felt like a new chapter was beginning, reuniting with Elijah and facing the past. As Leah stepped off the plane and entered the busy terminal, a wave of fatigue hit her, heavier than the weight of her duffel bag. Her boots echoed against the polished floor as she walked past passengers hustling to their destinations. Each step felt like a small release, a gradual shedding of the tension that had built up during the flight. The exchange with David had left a lingering feeling of closure, but Leah couldn't help but feel as though she was stepping into something far more challenging, the reality of home. She scanned the sea of faces at the arrival's gate, searching for the one person who could ground her amidst the chaos, her brother Elijah. He had texted her that morning, telling her he would be waiting near baggage claim, and she found herself growing anxious to see him. It had been over a year since they had been face to face. Deployment had kept her away, and phone calls, as heartfelt as they were, couldn't replace the comfort of family. Elijah was hard to miss. Even in the crowded airport, Leah spotted him instantly, standing a little taller than most, with his broad shoulders and familiar, steady posture. His face lit up when he saw her, a wide smile spreading across his handsome features. He raised his hand in a wave, and Leah quickened her pace, suddenly feeling like a kid again, rushing to meet her older brother after school. "Elijah," Leah called out, her voice carrying over the noise of the terminal. When they finally reached each other, Elijah pulled her into a tight hug. And for a moment, Leah let herself melt into the embrace. His familiar scent of cedarwood and aftershave brought back memories of home, the home she had left behind so many times for duty. There was something about his presence that always made her feel safe, even when the world around her seemed to be spinning out of control. "Welcome home, Leah," Elijah said, his voice thick with emotion. He pulled back to look at her, his hand still resting on her shoulders. "You look good. Tired, but good." Leah laughed softly, shaking her head. "You should see the other guy." Elijah chuckled, but his eyes searched her face for the hidden truths, the things she wouldn't say. Leah could feel his unspoken questions. He wanted to know how she really was, but she wasn't sure if she was ready to talk about it. Not yet. "I've missed you, Eli," she said instead, using the nickname she had given him when they were kids. It feels like forever. It has been forever, he replied, picking up her duffel bag with ease. Come on, let's get out of here. You've had enough airports for a lifetime. The ride home was quiet, the hum of Elijah's old pickup truck filling the space between them. Leah stared out the window, watching the familiar sights of their small town roll by. The sun was setting, casting a golden glow over the fields and trees that lined the highway. This was the place where they had grown up, where their family had built a life. And yet every time Leah returned, it felt different. Or maybe she was the one who had changed. Mom's garden's still blooming, Elijah said, breaking the silence. I've been trying to keep it up the way she did, but it's not the same. Leah's heart tightened at the mention of their mother. She hadn't been back since the funeral, and the thought of walking into their childhood home without seeing her mother's warm smile or hearing her gentle voice made her throat close up. She wasn't sure how she was going to handle it, but she knew it was inevitable. Home wasn't just a place anymore. It was a memory, a piece of the past that she couldn't fully return to. I'm sure it looks great, Leah said softly, though she wasn't sure she believed it. Their mother had been the heart of their home, and without her, everything felt off balance. Elijah glanced over at her, his expression unreadable. He had always been good at hiding his emotions, just like Leah, but she could tell he was struggling too. Losing their mother had hit him hard, harder than he had let on. She had been the glue that held them together after their father's death, and now that she was gone, it was just the two of them, trying to figure out how to navigate the world without her. You don't have to talk about it if you're not ready, Elijah said, his voice gentle. I know it's going to be hard, walking into that house. But I'm here. We'll get through it together. Leah nodded, grateful for his understanding. She wasn't ready to talk about the funeral, or the guilt she felt for not being there. Not yet, but knowing Elijah was there, that he didn't expect her to be okay right away, was enough for now. When they pulled up to the house, Leah felt a lump rise in her throat. The old two-story home looked the same as it always had, white paint peeling in some places, a wraparound porch with the swing their father had built by hand, and the small garden that their mother had tended to every morning. The sight of it brought back a flood of memories, both good and bad, and Leah wasn't sure she was ready to face them. Elijah parked the truck and turned to her, his eyes soft. Take your time, he said quietly. There's no rush. Leah nodded, her hands gripping the seatbelt as though it were a lifeline. She took a deep breath, trying to steady herself, but the emotions swirling inside her were too strong. She had faced enemy fire, survived ambushes, and led soldiers into battle, but walking into that house without her mother felt like an insurmountable challenge. Finally, Leah unbuckled her seatbelt and opened the door. The cool evening air hit her face, and she stepped out of the truck, her boots crunching against the gravel driveway. Elijah grabbed her duffel bag from the back and walked beside her as they made their way up the porch steps. Each step felt heavier than the last, and by the time they reached the front door, Leah's legs felt like lead. Elijah unlocked the door and pushed it open, the familiar creak of the hinges sending a shiver down Leah's spine. She stepped inside, the scent of the house wrapping around her like a blanket. It smelled the same, wood polish, the faint hint of lavender from the sachets their mother had tucked into every drawer, and the lingering scent of home-cooked meals. But the silence was deafening. Leah stood frozen in the entryway, her eyes scanning the living room. Everything was as it had been. Her mother's favorite quilt draped over the back of the couch, family photos lining the walls, the bookshelves filled with novels their mother had read over the years. But without her presence, the house felt empty, hollow. Elijah placed her duffel bag at the foot of the stairs and turned to her, his face a mix of concern and understanding. Leah, you don't have to go through this alone, he said softly. I know it's hard. I miss her too. Every day. Leah swallowed hard, the tears she had been holding back threatening to spill over. I wasn't here, she whispered, her voice trembling. I wasn't here when she needed me. Elijah stepped closer, placing a hand on her shoulder. You were doing what you had to do, he said firmly. She understood that. We all did. You can't carry that guilt with you, Leah. It's not what she would have wanted. Leah nodded, but the guilt still weighed heavy on her heart. She had always prided herself on being there for her family, on protecting the people she loved, but when her mother had needed her the most, she had been half a world away. No amount of phone calls or letters could make up for that. That night after dinner, Leah found herself sitting on the porch swing, staring out at the darkened sky. The stars twinkled overhead, and the cool breeze rustled the leaves of the oak tree in the yard. Elijah had gone to bed early, giving her the space she needed to process everything. The house was quiet now, but it wasn't the comforting kind of quiet she remembered. It was the quiet of absence. Leah leaned back in the swing, the soft creaking of the chains a familiar sound. She thought about her mother, about the way she had always sat here with a cup of tea, watching the world go by. Leah hadn't realized how much she missed those quiet moments until now. She had taken them for granted, always in a rush to leave, to get back to the military, to prove herself. Now, those moments were gone, and Leah wasn't sure how to fill the void they had left behind. Her thoughts drifted back to the flight, to the confrontation with David. His apology had been sincere, and she knew that his own grief had fueled his behavior. But Leah couldn't shake the feeling that her journey home had been a reminder of the battles she still had to fight. Battles with herself, with her past, and with the world that didn't always see her for who she truly was. Leah had always been a soldier, but now, as she sat in the stillness of the night, she realized that being home required a different kind of strength. It wasn't about survival anymore. It was about healing, about finding a way to live in a world that no longer felt familiar. She took a deep breath, letting the cool night air fill her lungs. There was no enemy to face, no mission to complete. But there was still work to be done, inside herself, in this home, and in the life she had to rebuild. And for the first time in a long time, Leah wasn't sure if she was ready for the fight ahead, the weight of silence and the path forward. The morning sunlight streamed through the lace curtains of Leah's old bedroom, casting soft patterns on the floor. She lay in her childhood bed, the familiar creak of the old mattress beneath her as she stared up at the ceiling. It was a strange feeling, being back in this room. The walls were still covered in posters from her teenage years, the desk cluttered with old notebooks and mementos from a life that felt like it belonged to someone else. Time had passed, but this room had stayed the same, frozen in a moment Leah couldn't return to. Her body ached from the long flight, the fatigue of her deployment clinging to her like a second skin. She hadn't slept well, her mind racing with memories and emotions she hadn't yet come to terms with. Being home was supposed to bring her peace, but instead, it had stirred something deeper, something she wasn't sure how to handle. Leah rolled onto her side and looked at the small photo on her nightstand. It was a picture of her and her mother, taken years ago when she had graduated from basic training. Her mother's face was full of pride, her arm draped over Leah's shoulders as they both smiled at the camera. Leah's smile, though, had been different. It had been full of hope and excitement for the future, a future that felt wide open and full of possibilities. Now that smile felt like a distant memory, replaced by the weight of everything she had seen, everything she had lost. A soft knock at the door pulled Leah from her thoughts. "Leah, you up?" Elijah's voice was muffled but gentle, as though he didn't want to disturb her if she was still sleeping. Leah sighed and sat up, running a hand through her messy hair. "Yeah, I'm up. Come in." The door creaked open, and Elijah stepped inside, a cup of coffee in his hand. He gave her a small smile, his eyes full of that familiar concern she had come to expect from him. "Thought you could use this," he said, handing her the steaming mug. Leah took it with a grateful nod, cradling the warmth in her hands. "Thanks, Eli." Elijah sat on the edge of the bed, his hands clasped together as he studied her face. Leah knew that look. He was waiting, giving her the space to speak, but she wasn't sure she was ready for the conversation he wanted to have. "You didn't sleep much, did you?" he asked gently. Leah shook her head, her eyes lowering to the coffee in her hands. Not really. It's weird being back. Elijah nodded, his expression softening. I figured it might be. It's been a long time, and a lot has changed. Leah could feel the weight of his words, the unspoken truth that hung between them. A lot had changed. Too much, maybe. And yet, the world around them seemed to carry on as though nothing had happened. Everything here feels the same, she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. But I don't feel like I fit anymore. Elijah sighed, leaning back against the headboard as he looked at her. I get that. But Leah, you've been through more than most people could even imagine. It's okay if things feel different. You've changed because you had to. That doesn't mean you don't belong. Leah swallowed hard, the lump in her throat making it difficult to speak. She had spent so much of her life trying to be strong, trying to push through whatever obstacles were thrown her way. But here, in the stillness of her childhood home, she felt exposed, vulnerable, and that scared her more than anything else. I don't know if I can do this, Leah admitted, her voice trembling. Being here, without Mom, without everything being the way it used to be. It's harder than I thought it would be. Elijah reached out and placed a comforting hand on her arm. I know it's hard, Leah, but you don't have to do this alone. I'm here. We can figure it out together. Leah looked up at him, tears welling in her eyes. She hadn't cried in a long time, not since the night her mother had passed away. She had held it all in, pushing down the grief, the guilt, the pain, because that was what she had been trained to do. But now, sitting here with Elijah, she felt that wall she had built start to crack. I wasn't here for her, Leah whispered, the tears finally spilling over. I wasn't here when she needed me. And I don't know how to forgive myself for that. Elijah's face softened, and he wrapped his arms around her, pulling her into a tight embrace. Leah clung to him, her body shaking with silent sobs as years of pent-up emotion poured out of her. She understood, Leah, Elijah said softly, his voice thick with emotion. She knew you were doing what you had to do. She was proud of you, so proud. You were always her hero. Don't carry that guilt with you. She wouldn't want that. Leah nodded, but the ache in her chest remained. She knew Elijah was right, but the weight of her guilt felt too heavy to shake. She had always been the one to protect others, to take care of everyone else, but when it came to her mother, she had failed. After a while, Leah pulled away, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. The tears had slowed, leaving behind a raw, hollow feeling in their wake. But there was also a sense of relief, like a valve had been released, and some of the pressure had lifted. I'm sorry, she said, her voice hoarse from crying. I didn't mean to fall apart like that. Elijah smiled, shaking his head. You don't have to apologize for anything. It's okay to let it out. You've been carrying too much for too long. Leah nodded, feeling a small flicker of gratitude for her brother's unwavering support. He had always been there for her, even when she didn't deserve it. Thanks, Eli, she said quietly, for everything. Elijah stood up and stretched, glancing toward the door. You want to come downstairs? I made breakfast. Figured we could eat before we head to the cemetery. Leah's stomach clenched at the mention of the cemetery. She hadn't visited her mother's grave since the funeral, and the thought of standing there, face to face with the finality of it all, terrified her. But she knew it was something she had to do, something she owed her mother and herself. Yeah, Leah said after a moment. I'll be down in a minute. Elijah gave her a reassuring nod and left the room, leaving Leah alone with her thoughts once more. She took a deep breath and looked around the room, her eyes landing on the photo of her and her mother again. This time, she didn't feel the same crushing guilt, only a deep sense of longing for the woman who had always believed in her, even when Leah had doubted herself. The drive to the cemetery was quiet, the radio playing softly in the background as Leah and Elijah made their way through the narrow streets of their small town. Leah stared out the window, her mind a whirlwind of emotions. She wasn't sure what she was going to say when she stood at her mother's grave, if she could say anything at all. But she knew she needed to be there, to face the reality she had been avoiding for so long. When they arrived at the cemetery, the sight of the gravestones lined up in neat rows made Leah's chest tighten. Elijah parked the truck near the entrance, and they both stepped out, the cool breeze brushing against their skin. The sky was overcast, gray clouds hanging low as though reflecting the heaviness of the day. Elijah walked beside her as they made their way to their mother's grave, his presence a quiet comfort. Leah's heart pounded in her chest as they approached the familiar headstone, the one she had seen only once before. Her mother's name was etched into the stone, along with the dates marking the beginning and end of a life that had shaped Leah in more ways than she could count. Leah knelt down in front of the grave, her fingers tracing the smooth surface of the headstone. The sight of it brought a fresh wave of emotion, but this time, she didn't push it away. She let herself feel the grief, the loss, and the love that still lived within her. "I'm sorry I wasn't here," Leah whispered, her voice trembling. "I should have been here. I should have been with you." Elijah stood beside her, silent but supportive, giving her the space she needed. Leah closed her eyes, taking a deep breath as she tried to find the words she had been holding back for so long. "I miss you every day. And I promise I'll find a way to be okay. But I need you to know, I've never stopped loving you. I've never stopped carrying you with me." The wind rustled the trees around them, the leaves whispering softly in the breeze. It was as though the world was giving her space to speak, to grieve, to heal. Leah opened her eyes, her heart feeling a little lighter. She wasn't sure if she would ever fully heal from the pain of losing her mother, but standing here, in this quiet place, she felt a sense of peace that had eluded her for so long. She had been through hell and back, but she was still standing. And that, she realized, was enough. Elijah placed a hand on her shoulder, his silent support a reminder that she wasn't alone in this journey. They stood there for a while longer, the quiet of the cemetery wrapping around them like a comforting blanket. That evening, as the sun set over the horizon and cast a golden light across the sky, Leah sat on the porch swing once again, her mind calmer than it had been in years. The house felt different now, not as heavy, not as empty. It still carried the weight of her memories, but it no longer felt like a place of loss. It was a place of love, of family, of everything her mother had built. Leah had faced battles on the battlefield, and now she was facing the battle within herself. But for the first time, she felt like she could win. The journey wasn't over, but it was no longer something to fear. It was a path forward, one she would walk with the strength her mother had given her, and the love that had always guided her. Leah took a deep breath, her heart full as she looked out at the world in front of her. The future was still uncertain, but she knew one thing for sure: she was home.